She didn't speak a word, but the moment she stepped into the terminal, the energy shifted. No one knew who she was, but they felt it. A quiet power radiated from her, not in the way she dressed or the bag she carried, but in her presence, something that set her apart from the rest. The first-class passengers, with their shiny luggage and tailored suits, didn't notice at first. But as Autumn Riley walked past them, they did a double-take, just for a second, as if something in the way she moved caught them off guard. She didn't have the right look. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in a place where wealth and status defined who belonged and who didn't. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand attention. She simply existed in a space where the rules of who could be seen and who should be overlooked were meant to keep people like her at the margins. And yet, despite how out of place she might have seemed, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The gate agent glanced at her as she approached the counter, eyes flicking down to the boarding pass in her hand, then straight back up to her face. He didn't even check her details. There was no need. In his mind, a woman like her didn't belong in a seat like that. When he summoned security, it was with a kind of finality that could only come from someone who assumed they had the power to decide who should stay and who should go. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't care for one. He just raised his hand, a signal, and within seconds, 2 uniformed officers appeared from nowhere, marching toward her with a steady, purposeful gait. The silence of the moment seemed to echo around her. She didn't flinch, didn't protest, just waited, her gaze steady as they approached. No words had been spoken, but there was a clear understanding in the air, something unspoken, something that said, "You don't belong here." And as they made their way to her, pulling her gently out of the queue, she didn't fight back. She simply went with them, as if to show them that she didn't need to make a scene to prove her point. But even in that silence, she knew that something was shifting beneath the surface. The people around her didn't speak up, didn't protest. They just watched, maybe too afraid to stand out themselves, maybe too conditioned to see her as nothing more than a disruption. It wasn't about race or status, it was about control, about the way people like her were meant to fit into a system that kept the powerful at the top and the rest beneath them. But here's the thing no one knew, no one could have guessed. The woman they tried to dismiss wasn't just a woman in a hoodie with a canvas tote bag. She wasn't someone who needed their approval. She wasn't a passenger in the way they understood passengers. They didn't know she wasn't just holding a boarding pass for a first-class seat. No, what she was really holding was far more powerful than that. She wasn't just a traveler, she was the final vote in a massive $4.1 billion airline merger. The kind of power that no one, not the gate agent, not the flight crew, not even the executives sitting behind their polished desks, could see coming. As the officers escorted her off the plane, there was no tension in her body, no anger, no defiance, just calm, just control. She knew something they didn't. When you don't fit the mold, when you don't conform to their expectations, you're not just invisible. You become a threat. But she wasn't a threat. She wasn't there to fight. She was there to make them see just how little they understood the power they thought they controlled. And when Autumn Riley reached her destination, when the people who had tried to erase her finally realized who she was, nothing would ever be the same again. The question now wasn't about who she was or what she was doing there. The real question was, how did they let it get this far? Autumn didn't rush. She didn't need to. She moved through the terminal with the kind of purpose that made every step seem deliberate. Her first-class boarding pass had been glanced at once, dismissed in an instant, but she knew better than to let that shake her. She'd been through worse. She had learned years ago that the world wasn't going to hand you anything just because you deserved it. No, you had to make your presence known, and sometimes that meant stepping back, blending in, and letting people underestimate you until they had no choice but to reckon with the power you held. She had learned this long before today, back when she was just a young woman traveling to a funeral. It was there, on that first flight, that she had realized the world didn't give you respect. It waited to see how much you would take before it decided whether you earned it. And so, when she saw the man in the well-tailored suit and the Bluetooth headset look her over with a slight flicker of confusion, Autumn didn't flinch. She just held up her phone, the digital boarding pass lighting up the screen, and waited. He hesitated for a moment before scanning it, but even after he gave her that brief, forced smile, she could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't think she belonged. His attitude shifted slightly as he glanced over her shoulder, no doubt sizing up the businessman behind her, someone who clearly fit the mold of who was supposed to be in the priority lane. But Autumn, she didn't fit that mold. And yet, there she was, standing in line, moving toward the gate with calm precision. She wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't there for anyone's approval. She was just there to get where she needed to go. The moment wasn't lost on her. She had felt it before, the little glances, the way people passed judgment on her without saying a word. She had felt the weight of their assumptions like a shadow trailing her every step. But she was used to it. It wasn't her first time. She had learned to carry her own weight, to navigate spaces where she was neither seen nor acknowledged. But today, that was about to change. She didn't know exactly when it would happen or how, but Autumn knew one thing for certain. She was more than just another passenger, and the truth of who she was would come to light when the time was right. It was a test, and she was ready to see how far they would push before they realized who was really in control. As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Autumn knew something was coming. She could feel it, a shift, a tension in the air. When her bag was flagged for a random check, she didn't argue. She just let it happen. When the agent rifled through her belongings, pausing on the folder that contained the sealed envelope, she didn't say a word. She simply watched, knowing that this moment was just another piece in the puzzle. They might not see it now, but soon they would. Soon, everything would change. Autumn sat back in her seat as the plane began to taxi down the runway, her fingers gently resting on the envelope, the one she had carried with her ever since she stepped into the terminal. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was the final decision, the key to a $4.1 billion merger that was now in her hands, whether anyone realized it or not. As the plane ascended into the sky, she couldn't help but notice the way people around her settled into the false comfort of their privilege. The businessman in the seat next to her was already back to his email, his fingers tapping away at the screen with a rhythm that only people used to their own power could afford. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, gliding down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks to the other passengers, none of them sparing even a moment to glance at her. She didn't belong to this world, at least not in their eyes. She wasn't part of the hierarchy that decided who got special treatment and who didn't. To them, Autumn wasn't worth looking at twice. She was just another face in the crowd, someone who somehow slipped through the cracks, someone who didn't have the right credentials, the right look. But none of them knew she was the one who held the final say in the deal that would change everything for them. As the cabin lights dimmed and the flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisle, Autumn took a quiet moment to reflect on the path that had led her here. She had been taught from a young age that power didn't always come from being loud. It didn't come from demanding attention. The quietest people in the room were often the ones who held the real strength. It was a lesson she had learned early on. When you didn't fit the mold of what others expected, you didn't have to fight. You didn't have to shout or demand respect. No, you just had to wait. And when the time was right, you could show them exactly how much power you held in your hands without ever raising your voice. That was why, when the flight attendants passed her row for the second time, ignoring her like she didn't exist, she remained still. She didn't react. She didn't make a fuss. She just let it happen. Their behavior wasn't accidental. It wasn't a mistake. It was part of a pattern, one that she had seen before in boardrooms and conference calls, in places where people like her were expected to stay in the background, where her worth was measured by things she couldn't control, things like her skin, her gender, her appearance. But she wasn't playing by their rules. She knew better. She had learned to navigate a system that was designed to make her invisible. And now, as she sat in this plane, surrounded by people who thought she didn't belong, she was preparing to turn everything they thought they knew upside down. The moment arrived when one of the flight attendants, a woman with dark hair pulled back into a sleek bun, paused at her row. Autumn had noticed her earlier. Sloane, her name tag read. She wasn't the friendliest of the attendants. Her smile had always been tight, her eyes cold. But now, as she leaned in with that same practiced smile, Autumn could feel the subtle shift in the air. The woman was here for a reason, and it wasn't to be kind. She asked if Autumn would like a drink, but the tone of her voice, the way she lingered just a moment too long, made it clear that this was more than just a question. It was a test, a challenge. Sloane had already decided that Autumn wasn't a person worth serving, and now she was waiting to see if she would conform, if she would play along with the charade. But Autumn didn't respond the way they expected. She didn't argue. She didn't complain. She simply raised an eyebrow as if to acknowledge the game, and then spoke quietly, almost too calmly. "Just water," she said, her voice steady. The hesitation in Sloane's expression was brief, but it was enough. She glanced down at the manifest, checking for the umpteenth time whether Autumn was supposed to be in that seat. When she confirmed that, yes, Autumn was a first-class passenger, her eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and something darker, resentment, perhaps, or disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had written her off the moment she walked onto the plane. She wasn't supposed to be here, in this seat, with the same rights and privileges as everyone else. But now, Autumn wasn't playing by the rules. She was testing them, quietly, carefully, watching every interaction, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally surface. Sloane's attempt at condescension didn't go unnoticed. The fact that she hesitated, that she questioned Autumn's request for a simple drink, was a subtle reflection of the bigger system that was working behind the scenes. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about power. The flight attendant wasn't serving her the way she should have been served because Autumn didn't belong in her world. She wasn't part of their inner circle. She wasn't one of the people who wore the right clothes or spoke the right way. But the more they tried to make her feel invisible, the more her presence began to fill the space around her. And soon they would realize that power wasn't about fitting in. It was about knowing when to stand your ground, even when everyone else was too busy pretending that you didn't matter. As the flight continued, Autumn's mind was sharp, cataloging each moment with precision. She wasn't reacting to them, wasn't letting them see the frustration or anger she might have felt. She didn't need to. She knew that the real game was being played in silence. The way the flight attendants ignored her, the way they made her feel like she didn't deserve a single moment of attention, was part of the test. But what they didn't realize was that she had already won. They were playing by their own rules, but she wasn't bound by them. She didn't have to shout to be heard. She just had to wait, to let the silence build, to let them make their own mistakes. Sloane and her colleagues didn't realize that the more they tried to isolate her, the more they would expose the cracks in their own system. Power wasn't just about having the right to sit in first class. It was about having the ability to test those who thought they had control, to make them feel the pressure of their own assumptions. And as the hours passed, Autumn's understanding of this power only grew stronger. The more they tried to erase her, the more her presence filled the space around them. She wasn't just any passenger. She was the one who held the final say, the one who could change everything with a single signature. And soon, they would all find out that ignoring her wasn't just a mistake. It was a miscalculation that would cost them everything. The flight continued, but Autumn had already checked out. Not physically. She was still in her seat, still absorbing everything. But mentally, she had moved beyond their petty games. She wasn't here for their approval. She wasn't here for their service. She was here to see if the system, the one that had worked so tirelessly to keep people like her at the margins, could withstand the weight of someone who didn't need to play by its rules. They thought they controlled the game, but Autumn was the one holding the cards. And as the plane soared through the skies, she waited patiently, knowing that her moment was coming. And when it arrived, it would be with a quiet finality that no one would be able to ignore. The flight continued on, the hum of the engines becoming a steady backdrop to the growing tension inside the cabin. Autumn's seat, nestled near the front of first class, had felt like a carefully crafted stage for the drama unfolding around her. The moment the flight attendants had ignored her request for service, she knew this was no accident. The small details, the unspoken shifts in tone, the way her presence was continuously overlooked, had begun to coalesce into something bigger, something that told her exactly what kind of game she was playing. The pressure of the hierarchy in the cabin was palpable. She was part of the system, yet completely outside it. She had been singled out, not because of anything she had done, but because of who they thought she was, or rather, who they thought she wasn't. As the flight attendants continued their rounds, Autumn watched them serve the other passengers with ease, always with the perfect smile, always with the kind of attention that she could tell had been meticulously rehearsed. But when it came to her, it was different. The drinks were passed over her, the meals skipped right over her row, and even simple pleasantries were bypassed. She wasn't some invisible woman. She was a test, one that no one on this flight had been prepared for. Each deliberate oversight, each moment of exclusion, was part of a pattern she had come to recognize. They didn't see her as one of them, not in this space. They didn't see her as someone worthy of their best service, even though the rules said otherwise. But it wasn't just about the way they were treating her. It was about something more, the way they assumed who belonged in the first-class section and who didn't. Autumn was starting to realize that every slight, every moment of discomfort wasn't just about her. It wasn't even about how she was being treated. It was about what it revealed. It revealed the deep-seated biases in the system, the assumptions that dictated who was worthy of respect and who was to be ignored. The truth was, the system didn't see her, not truly. They didn't know who she was or what she represented, and that made all the difference. This wasn't just a test of her patience. It was a test of their system's integrity, and so far, it was failing miserably. Every moment of exclusion was a piece of evidence, each slight a nail in the coffin of the carefully constructed system they thought they had control over. But what they didn't know was that Autumn had already noticed everything. She had already taken stock of their behavior, the subtle ways they had singled her out. And now, she wasn't just waiting for the right moment, she was creating it. She hadn't said a word, hadn't raised her voice, but everything around her had begun to shift. She could feel it in the air, a quiet tension building in the space between the passengers, between the crew. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was there, thick and undeniable. That was when the first real challenge came. The man next to her, the one who had been glued to his tablet since the moment they took off, looked up with mild surprise when the flight attendants passed him by and turned their attention to her, or rather, ignored her. He leaned toward her, his voice a little louder than necessary, as if to make sure everyone knew he was speaking directly to the flight crew. "Hey," he said, his voice just loud enough for others to hear, "she's in first." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was a statement, a comment that implied she didn't belong, or at least didn't fit. His eyes flickered toward the flight attendant who passed by, but his words were still hanging in the air. The attendant, of course, didn't acknowledge him or even look at Autumn, but it was clear what he was doing. He was trying to make sure the flight attendants knew he wasn't fooled by her presence. She didn't belong, not in first class, not among his kind. Sloane, one of the flight attendants who had been circling her row all flight, laughed softly but not enough to hide her condescension. "She's on the list," she replied, brushing past him with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't need to look at Autumn. She didn't need to engage. She just assumed that of course Autumn couldn't have earned her seat in first class. They all assumed it. And in that moment, Autumn felt the weight of it. The system they had built to exclude her, the silent barriers they had erected to keep people like her out. But instead of confronting them, she leaned back into her seat, her fingers brushing against the envelope once more. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to fight. She was there to let them make their own mistakes. It wasn't long before Autumn knew the real game was afoot. Every action, every word, every glance was now part of a much larger narrative. It wasn't about her individual experience anymore. It was about testing a system built on assumptions, a system that was beginning to unravel piece by piece, right before their eyes. She didn't have to speak up. She didn't have to shout. All she had to do was exist in that space, to quietly remind them that power doesn't come from conforming. It comes from owning your space, no matter how hard they try to push you out of it. As the flight wore on, the flight attendants continued to avoid her. They skipped over her when the food cart came by, and when she gently cleared her throat to get their attention, they acted like they hadn't heard her. It wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. They didn't just think she didn't belong, they wanted her to know she didn't belong. But Autumn had seen enough. Every action, every moment of exclusion was now another piece in the puzzle. She wasn't just observing their behavior, she was cataloging it, keeping track of the small details that would eventually reveal the full scope of their failure. And all the while, she was calm. She was silent, but she wasn't powerless. It was then that the moment she had been waiting for arrived. The captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling that they were beginning their descent. As the plane began to descend toward the airport, the feeling in the cabin shifted once more. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anxiety. It was something more subtle, something more dangerous. Power had begun to shift. The flight attendants, once so sure of themselves, now moved with a certain unease. They weren't looking at Autumn anymore like they used to. They were glancing at her in quick, furtive movements, as if they weren't sure what to do. Autumn had known all along that this was never going to be about a meal or a drink. It was about control, about power, about whether she would fall into line with the system they had built or whether she would challenge it. And with each small slight, with each overlooked moment, she had done exactly that. She hadn't said a word, but now the truth was clear. The system had tried to push her aside, tried to erase her with its indifference. But Autumn Riley wasn't someone who could be erased, and soon the truth would come out. Every act of exclusion, every tiny indignity was now a chain link that would bind them together, and they wouldn't be able to escape it. It was time, and when the plane touched down and the doors opened, the first thing Autumn did wasn't rush to deboard. It wasn't even to glance at the crew who had tried to ignore her. Number She stayed where she was, quiet and calm, waiting. They had done their work, made their mistakes, assumed they knew who she was, and now she was about to show them how wrong they were. The turbulence started when the lead cabin manager, Bryce, stepped into the aisle. It wasn't the kind of turbulence that rattled the plane, but it was certainly the kind that made the hairs on the back of Autumn's neck stand up. He was tall, authoritative, and had a clipboard in hand. The kind of man who thought his presence could command attention. But Autumn wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. The moment he approached, she knew exactly what he was here for. They were trying to bait her, trying to find something, anything, that would justify their treatment of her. His eyes flicked toward her seat, then down at her boarding pass, lingering a moment too long on the details, as if searching for some discrepancy that would give them an excuse to escalate. She knew they had already made up their minds about her. They had already decided she wasn't supposed to be in that seat, but now they had to find a reason to validate their assumptions. She could almost see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed what he was about to say. He paused, taking an unnecessary amount of time to study her boarding pass. The seconds stretched like minutes. She remained calm, watching him, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. She had expected this. She had been prepared for the moment when they would challenge her again, when the system would push back, and the mask of civility would finally slip. "Ms. Riley," Bryce said, his voice measured, but there was a tightness to it. "We've had a seating issue. I'm going to need to rescan your credentials." He was being polite, but there was an edge to it, something unspoken, something that made it clear he wasn't just doing this out of routine. He needed to find something, and if that meant making her uncomfortable, so be it. Autumn didn't flinch. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She simply unlocked her phone and handed it to him with a smooth, practiced motion. Her fingers grazed the screen and held it up toward him without a second thought. The boarding pass was clear. No errors, no inconsistencies. She knew what he was doing. He was hoping he could find a reason to claim that she didn't belong, that her seat had been assigned in error, or worse, that there had been a mix-up that could lead to her removal. But Autumn wasn't the one who had made the mistake. She wasn't the one who had miscalculated. That was all on them. As he scanned the boarding pass, his eyes narrowed. He seemed to linger just a moment too long, scanning the details with what felt like a deliberate intent to find a flaw. But there was nothing. She wasn't going to give him any reason to question her presence on this flight. So, after a beat, he looked up at her with a slight frown, his face betraying a flicker of doubt. "Strange," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Must have been a sync error." Bryce didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the awkwardness. He just stood there at the edge of her seat, trying to brush off the fact that he had just subjected her to a pointless search for a problem that didn't exist. He didn't know who she was. He didn't understand the weight she carried, and right now he was doing his best to brush off the mistake. But Autumn didn't let him off the hook so easily. She had been in enough meetings, seen enough backroom deals to know when someone was trying to cover their tracks, and she knew this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The other flight attendants passed by again, their eyes skimming over her like she didn't exist, as if they were deliberately pretending not to see her. But Autumn's patience wasn't endless. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She just wasn't going to let this go without calling it out. When Bryce finally moved away, she took the moment of his distraction to make her point. Her voice was calm, but it held an edge, a quiet firmness that made it clear she wasn't going to be ignored any longer. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said, her words deliberate. "I'm being inconvenienced unnecessarily, and I want a record of it." There was no anger in her tone, no demand, just a simple request that made it clear she wasn't playing their game. Bryce hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her calm defiance. His mouth opened as if he was about to argue, but then he closed it again. There was nothing to argue. He couldn't deny that she had every right to ask for a supervisor. He nodded stiffly, his body language tightening. "I'll let them know," he said flatly. But Autumn didn't care about his discomfort. She had already won. The system had just made a costly error, and now it was scrambling to cover its tracks. As Bryce walked away, Autumn sat back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the envelope she had placed carefully in the seat pocket. She hadn't said much, but her presence had been enough to throw them off course. The flight attendants had been so sure of themselves, so confident that they could push her aside, that they hadn't anticipated someone who wasn't going to quietly accept their treatment. They hadn't anticipated someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to make sure they understood one thing. She wasn't the one who needed to be questioned. When the beverage cart finally came through, the same flight attendants who had been ignoring her passed by again. But this time, something was different. As the cart came close, one of the attendants, a younger man, fresh-faced, clearly new to the job, paused by her seat, hesitating as if unsure of what to do. He glanced at the manifest, his eyes shifting between it and her, clearly confused about whether he was supposed to serve her. He cleared his throat, awkwardly. "Didn't like the fish?" he asked, his voice almost apologetic. It was a question born out of insecurity. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to serve her or not. He was simply trying to follow the protocol. But the protocol, like the rest of the system, had been built on assumptions. He wasn't sure if she belonged in first class, and that confusion was a clear indication that the cracks in their system were beginning to show. Autumn didn't respond immediately. She simply looked up at him, her gaze steady, and when she spoke, it wasn't with the anger or frustration that the crew seemed to expect. She was calm in a way that made her power even more evident. "It was cold," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet finality. "But it's not about the food, is it?" Her words hung in the air, unanswered. She wasn't playing their game. She wasn't here for their service. She wasn't here to demand what was hers. She was here to make them see the flaws in the system they had built. She had already given them everything they needed. And yet they were still trying to find a way to make her seem like the problem. The cart moved on, and the attendant turned, clearly unsure of what to make of the interaction. His confusion wasn't his fault, it was theirs. It was the result of the silent bias that had been woven into the fabric of the system long before Autumn stepped onto this plane. And as the minutes ticked by, she remained still, every movement deliberate. She wasn't going to let them define her experience. She was going to make them see the truth. But even as the plane descended, even as she made her way through the final stages of the flight, she knew the real challenge was still to come. It wasn't the flight attendants' passive-aggressive treatment. It wasn't the way they avoided her presence or tried to subtly undermine her. No, the real test would come when they realized just who they had been treating this way. The moment they found out that the person they had treated like a ghost, the person they had tried to push aside, wasn't just some passenger. They were the one who held the future of the airline in their hands. And when that moment came, when the full weight of her identity became clear, the flight attendants, the cabin crew, and the executives in charge would realize something very important, that their treatment of her wasn't just a mistake. It was the reason everything was about to change. Autumn's patience was no longer just a quiet stance. It had become a weapon. As the plane began to descend toward the airport, the tension in the cabin seemed to escalate. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the hum of the engines providing an eerie soundtrack to the building unease. Flight attendants walked the aisles, their eyes nervously darting over Autumn, their practiced smiles becoming strained. They could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted. What had been a controlled, familiar environment was now bristling with the silent energy of something off. No one dared to speak it aloud, but they all knew that something wasn't right. They had tried to ignore her, to treat her like she didn't belong, to strip her of her seat, her comfort, her dignity, but it hadn't worked. No matter how hard they tried, she wasn't going anywhere. She was there to test their assumptions, and so far they had failed. The flight attendants, once so confident, now seemed disoriented, caught in a web of their own making. They had misjudged her, underestimated the power of someone who had learned how to move through the world without demanding a seat at the table, someone who had been quietly biding her time until the right moment arrived. That moment had come, and now, as the plane's wheels began to touch down on the tarmac, it was clear that the ripple effect of her presence would be felt far beyond the confines of this flight. There was no denying it anymore. The system had failed her in ways they hadn't even realized, and the cracks in their authority were now too wide to ignore. As the plane taxied to the gate, Autumn remained still in her seat, watching the other passengers gather their things, speaking in hushed voices, oblivious to the change that had already started. They didn't know it yet, but their treatment of her had just revealed a larger flaw in the system they all relied on, and now it was too late to turn back. When the cabin door finally opened, when the passengers began to shuffle toward the exit, Autumn moved slowly, deliberately. She didn't rush to leave. She didn't feel the need to, not when the truth of the situation was clearer than ever. The system, the hierarchy they had worked so hard to maintain, was crumbling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. She stood calmly, slipping her bag over her shoulder and making her way toward the jet bridge, where a figure in a navy suit was already waiting. The man didn't need to introduce himself. His posture was stiff, formal, and his eyes flickered nervously as he took in Autumn's approach. The air around him seemed thick with tension. This was it, the moment when everything changed. The uniformed security officers who had been stationed by the door shifted slightly, as if bracing for something they didn't fully understand yet. The man in the navy suit extended his hand, but it was clear that Autumn wasn't about to make this easy for him. She didn't need his handshake. She didn't need his acknowledgement. She didn't need anything from them. Instead, she simply spoke, her voice steady and unshaken. "I'm here for the report," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. The man faltered, his hand still outstretched, but Autumn didn't take it. She wasn't here to shake hands. She was here to make them acknowledge the reality of what had just transpired. The flight, the treatment, the systematic efforts to erase her presence, they had all led to this moment. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to cause a scene. All she needed to do was show them that they had made a grave mistake, and they would have to deal with the consequences. The security officers shifted uneasily as the man in the navy suit glanced over at them, signaling with a subtle motion that they should follow her. Autumn's steps were deliberate, each one a reminder that she wasn't playing their game. She wasn't just some passive observer. She was the one who had been quietly pulling the strings all along. The small room where they escorted her felt cold, sterile, the kind of place where decisions were made in private, where the powers that be could try to hide their mistakes without anyone noticing. But Autumn wasn't going to let them. As the door clicked shut behind her, she wasted no time. "I assume you've already seen the report?" she asked, her gaze locking with the man in the navy suit. He glanced at his tablet, his fingers moving nervously over the screen. "Yes," he said slowly, though his tone didn't carry the confidence it had a moment ago. "We've received some, concerns about your behavior." His words were carefully measured, but Autumn could hear the hesitation. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say next. They hadn't anticipated someone like her, someone who knew exactly what was going on, someone who understood the game better than they did. Autumn didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her presence filling the room in a way that made him uncomfortable. "Concerns?" she repeated, her voice calm but sharp. "Concerns about what exactly?" He cleared his throat, his fingers still tapping over the screen as he read the notes. "Well, it's, your movements during the flight," he said, stumbling over the words. "Some passengers noted that you seemed agitated, perhaps non-compliant with the seat regulations." Autumn's eyes narrowed slightly, her patience wearing thin. "Agitated?" she asked, her voice like ice. "I wasn't agitated. I was seated, as required. I simply refused to comply with arbitrary requests. But let's be clear about one thing," she said, her words deliberate. "I don't answer to your system. I don't answer to anyone who thinks they can simply control me because of what they assume about me. Do you understand?" The man didn't answer at first. He just stared at her, as if trying to process what she had said. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. But Autumn wasn't done. She wasn't just calling out their treatment of her, she was calling out the entire system that allowed it to happen in the first place. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice low and steady. "You misjudged me. You assumed I wasn't who I am, and now you're going to fix it." She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't need to. She knew what would happen next. The man shifted uncomfortably, looking over at the two security officers who stood by the door. They were silent, but their posture had changed. They could feel it too. The moment when they had underestimated her was over. She was in control now, and they knew it. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man finally said, though his words lacked the conviction they had had earlier. "But I'll make sure this gets addressed." Autumn nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Good," she said, her voice crisp, "because the next step is making sure that this doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else." She turned and walked out of the room, the silence behind her thick with the weight of everything unsaid. The security officers followed her, their footsteps hesitant. They didn't know what to do with her. They didn't know how to deal with someone who had taken control of the situation so effortlessly, so quietly. They had assumed she was just another passenger, someone they could ignore, someone they could push around. But she wasn't. She was the one who had the power. As Autumn made her way through the terminal, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some of them had no idea what had just happened. They didn't know how the game had changed. They didn't know that the woman who had been so silently ignored was the one who had just rewritten the rules. She moved through the airport with a calm confidence, her steps echoing against the marble floors. They couldn't see it yet, but the weight of what had just transpired was already beginning to settle in. And as she passed through the final security check, the last gate before she left the terminal, the whispers began. People started talking, questioning who she really was. It was only a matter of time before the full truth came out. The truth about the power she held, the power they had tried to deny her. But Autumn didn't need anyone's recognition. She didn't need applause or validation. All she needed was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the system had failed, that the people who had tried to erase her had underestimated the wrong person. The truth would come out, in time, and when it did, everything would change.